Okay, guys, so today what we're going to be talking about is World War One, a pretty brief overview of like the causes, the main events, and also the legacy and the treaty of it. So it's again going to be like the causes of the war, the main events, the characteristics of the war, and the outcome of the war. So make sure you guys have the graphic organizer and you're filling it in as we move along. I'm gonna go pretty quickly through here, so you might have to um, pause as needed. So, um, World War One pretty much is just a global crisis, especially for Europe. Um, we have six main powers in Europe, six countries that were considered the great powers, and that would be Great Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. And they're all kind of competing, and through our age of imperialism, they're gaining in power and they're competing with one another. And Germany comes on the scene in a really big way. And it starts to kind of make their neighbors nervous. Germany has industrialized, they have a growing economic and military power, which is going to lead Russia to ally with France and Britain, because Germany initially is going to seek alliances that's going to isolate France because Germany's worried that France is going to try and get them back for the Franco-Prussian War. So they ally with Austria-Hungary to try and isolate France. Well, that leads France to seek an alliance with Russia, so that if something happens, then Germany's going to have to fight on two fronts. Um, so if you fight in two places at once, it's going to weaken your resources and then make them easier to defeat. And Britain doesn't like the fact that Germany is expanding their navy to compete with theirs, so they end up forming alliances with Russia and France, which is going to create our alliance system of the early 1900s. And that box where it says alliances, I need you to write down the Triple Entente, your allied powers, and list those countries in the Triple Alliance, or your Central Powers, and list those countries. These form your two sides of the war, so if you don't get these down, then you might be kind of confused as we go through. So by the early 1900s, we have two main alliance systems that have formed. You have the Triple Entente, which forms to kind of keep Germany in check. These countries become the Allied powers, which is Russia, France, and Great Britain. And on the other side, you have the Triple Alliance, which later becomes known as the Central Powers, due to their location in the center of Europe, which would be Germany, Austria-Hungary, and for a little while, Italy. The Ottoman Empire is going to jump in with Germany and Austria-Hungary as well. Italy switches sides, though, because they are still pretty upset at Austria-Hungary, who is controlling lands that the Italians think should be theirs. If you remember the Italian independence, they had to gain some of their land back from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they're not exactly happy with that empire. So in 1915, Italy's alliance shifts, and then they join the Triple Entente. But make sure you guys get the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, and you have those six countries listed. Our other causes are going to be imperialism and nationalism. So imperialism has this competition for colonial empires. If you remember, the more colonies you have signal the more power you have. So countries are competing to gain more land, which fuels this rivalry and mistrust between countries. Imperialism is very closely tied to nationalism, where ethnic groups want nations of their own. For example, the Slavic people in the Balkan region want their own countries, which the Balkan becomes known as the powder keg of Europe. So Serbia is an independent Slavic nation, and they want other Slavs to join them in their new nation state. As these other countries, well, territories in the Balkan region, start to fight for their independence, Serbia thinks that they should not be under the control of Austria-Hungary, but that because they are all Slavs, that they should be part of Serbia. So this area in the Balkans has several wars in the early 1900s trying to gain independence for these Slavic states and get away from the control of either the Austro-Hungarian or the Ottoman Empire. Militarism is another huge cause of World War I. Militarism is basically just glorifying the military. It's an arms race. Each nation is competing to get a bigger army or a navy than another one. And one of the scary parts for Europe here was that Germany was building up their navy with the intention that they wanted to challenge Great Britain. And the Germans built this huge new warship called the Dreadnought, which alarms Great Britain. But militarism is a very popular policy, and it remains a very popular policy through most of the 20th century. Because building and manufacturing weapons creates jobs in these countries. And at this point in the early 1900s, there's huge labor unrest, strikes, and trade unions that lead up to this point. So we have high unemployment, and this militarism, this process of building up your army, creates a lot of jobs. So people like militarism. All of this comes to a head when the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, when he is assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. So basically what was going on is that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was trying to take over the Balkans. As the Balkan regions fought for independence from the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire was trying to come in and take them over, and Serbia was not a fan. Again, they think that because people in the Balkans, a lot of them are Slavic, that they should be part of Serbia. So when a Serbian nationalist assassinates the Archduke, Austria-Hungary hands Serbia a list of demands and says, okay, you have to meet these demands or else we're going to war. But Austria-Hungary knew that there was no way that Serbia could meet these demands. So war is inevitable. So the spark of the war is going to be the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his very impressive mustache. He's assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia, which is in the Balkans, by a Serbian nationalist who doesn't like Austria's ownership. And Austria is going to declare war on Serbia, and Russia has to honor its alliance with Serbia. So Russia declares war on Austria. And eventually what happens is the alliance system kicks in. Whoops, sorry. And basically everyone's at war. These countries, they enter with excitement. They think it's going to be this jolly little war, and then they'll be home by Christmas. They have no idea basically what they're getting into. So the reality of the situation is that World War I easily could have been just a regional conflict in the Balkans between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. But it ends up being a full-scale war that's going to devastate most of Europe and a lot of North Africa. The fighting spreads out of Europe into Africa, into India, into Southeast Asia, and it's a domino effect. Russia jumps in to back Serbia, so Russia is going to declare war on Austria-Hungary. The next day, I think that's July 30th or 31st, August 1st, I think it was, Germany declares war on Russia. The next day, Germany declares war on France. And because Germany is going to declare war on France, they go through neutral Belgium, which is between the northern borders of France and Germany. When Germany invades neutral Belgium and declares war on them, Britain jumps in and declares war on Germany to back up Belgium. When Britain joins in, so does Japan, because they're an ally of Britain. And when Britain jumps in, they're going to drag their colonial territories into the fight. So like New Zealand, Australia, Canada. So honestly, it's really within about 5 days that we go from Austria-Hungary versus Serbia to Austria-Hungary and Germany versus Serbia, Russia, France, Japan, Britain. And it's a matter of days how it turns from a regional conflict into a global conflict. Germany's plan in the war is to fight a two-front war. It's called the Schlieffen Plan, which is a really fun thing to say. It was Germany's commander of their army was General Schlieffen, and the Schlieffen plan was to fight a two-front war. Well, was to quickly invade France, defeat them within 6 weeks, and then rush east to fight Russia because Russia's not industrialized, so it's going to take them forever to get their supplies to the Eastern Front. The reality, what happens is that Germany gets bogged down in the Western Front, which is the area between France and Germany, and it becomes a stalemate. Both sides are going to dig into trenches where they will spend the next 4 years fighting with hundreds of thousands of casualties on each side, and they never gain more than 5 miles in either direction. So with the trench warfare, this is when you're going to dig into a trench. It's about maybe 8 to 10 feet below ground and wait it out. The purpose of the trench warfare was to protect yourself from machine guns. Sometimes the whistle will blow and you'll run out and attack the enemy. It's called going over the top, and the land between the trenches is no man's land. So you'll go over the top and into no man's land and try and attack your enemy. But most of your time is spent in this miserable, muddy, unsanitary, rat-infested trench with dead bodies. It is not this jolly little war that they were supposed to have. You're basically living in mud for months at a time. There are rats everywhere, which sometimes you would use for food. Like I said, there are dead bodies in the trenches, which the soldiers would use with two purposes. Sometimes they would stack the bodies on top of the trench to make it taller, or sometimes they would stand on the dead body so they could shoot over the trench. And if a person didn't take care of their feet, it would lead to trench foot or immersion foot, which is a very, very disgusting condition, which I'm going to show you. This is, you see the soldiers going up over the trenches. They have the barbed wire to protect them from somebody running into their trench. And when it came to fighting from the trenches, you didn't want to be the first one out, because as soon as your head popped over the trench, then you were dead. But you also didn't want to be the last one out, because then you were seen as a coward. So a lot of people wanted to be like right in the middle here. Here is your trench foot, which is a very disgusting condition. Would happen if you didn't take care of your feet, which you couldn't really in the trenches. Trench foot or immersion foot happens when your feet are wet for a long time. And it's very painful, but it can be prevented and treated. You know you're getting trench foot if you get a tingling or itching sensation, pain, swelling in your feet, and cold, blotchy skin. There's a numbness or this like prickling or heavy feeling in the foot. If it gets really bad, the foot is going to be red, dry, and painful after it blisters. Once it blisters, the skin and the tissue could die and fall off. In severe cases, if you did not treat the trench foot, you could lose the toes, your heels, or your entire foot. So it's a very disgusting, painful condition. So the war drags on, and it's, like I said, it's a bloody stalemate. In just the Western Front, we have Germans that have lost 850,000 troops, the French that lost 700,000, and the British that lost over 400,000 troops. Most of these were going to be in the Battle of the Marne, which is one of the bloodiest battles of the war. They lost over 1 million soldiers in one day, the Battle of the Marne. Or the Battle of the Somme. I'm sorry, the Somme, not the Marne. So one of the things that come out of the war are new weapons and tactics of war. World War I is our first large-scale industrial war. And with the trenches, you have to be a little bit more creative because machine guns really aren't cutting it. The Germans are the first to use poison gas. There's a few different kinds that they would use. They would use sometimes chlorine and phosgene, which were both toxic gases that would suffocate you. Mustard gas became really popular, which was a really painful way to go. Mustard gas is going to first blister the skin. It's going to cause severe burns and blisters, and it's going to strip your lungs of their lining. It's a very painful condition, and sometimes it would take up to 5 weeks to die from your mustard gas. And here you have, these are Australian soldiers with their gas masks on. We also have the machine gun that's invented. The tanks and the airplanes were used to break up trench warfare, and then submarines were also implemented. This is one of the first times that submarines are used on a large scale. Here you have a couple victims from mustard gas burns. You can see where the skin is blistered on their back. This one, he's really severely blistered. Here is your machine gun. It's not like a Rambo, you know, running through the jungle with a machine gun and the ammo strapped to you. The Vickers machine gun here required 6 men to operate it. You had one person to fire, one person to feed the ammunition, one person was usually pouring water on it to cool it down, and the rest would help carry the weapon because it was about a 600-pound gun. Here is the first tank that was used, the Mark I. The British developed the tanks to go through barbed wire and go through the trenches. And the first tanks, you could walk faster than they rolled. They went about 4 miles an hour, so not a very fast ride. The Germans were the ones that were famous for using the U-boats, the underboats is what they called them. So, the Western Front, which is our stalemate, is going to be between France and Germany on that border. Our Eastern Front is the fighting along the German and Russian border. And early on, the Russians are able to push into Austria and Hungary, but eventually they have to retreat as Germany gets more resources to the Eastern Front. And honestly, by 1916, Russia's struggling with the war. They have several casualties. Russia loses more than any other power in the war when it's all said and done. Russia has not industrialized, so they cannot get their supplies to the troops fast enough. So a lot of times the men are fighting, you know, with very little food, very little ammunition, and they're just pretty much sending the soldiers to the front lines just to absorb the blows, basically. But Russia's greatest advantage when it comes to war is it's the size of its army. So it just kind of keeps sending troops to the front line to keep Germany busy. And it keeps Germany from being able to focus on the Western Front, which is where a lot of the fighting's going on. So the war's going to drag on for years with no clear winner. It's never really a clear advantage for one side over the other until 1917. The soldiers are miserable, they're sick, they're dying, and honestly they're disturbed by the civilians. Because the soldiers, they've kind of lost that zest for war as they realize that they're, you know, a bunch of teenagers basically each fighting each other, not really understanding why they're there. They start to lose their fight for the war. However, the civilian populace, so the people at home and not fighting, are still very, very passionate about the war and completely insensitive to the fact of what's really going on at the fronts. So the civilians actually hate the enemy more than the soldiers do because the civilians don't realize what's going on. There's a couple famous stories from the war about both sides getting together from time to time. The Christmas truce of 1914 is very famous. They stopped fighting on Christmas Day 1914, and the soldiers went out and had a football game. So they played soccer in no man's land. And they, you know, exchanged gifts and shook hands and had a good time. And, you know, it kind of took that fight out of them because they realized you put a face to an enemy. And then a lot of them hadn't done that before. So the soldiers are honestly pretty disturbed by what's going on at home. World War I becomes a total war, and that the governments are pretty much devoting all their resources to the war. Every side of the war is going to develop really extensive propaganda departments to persuade people one side or the other. Governments really shut down a lot of anti-war sentiment, so if you publish something that spoke out against the war, then it would be very heavily censored. For example, German propaganda was so strictly censored to its people that they had no clue that they faced setbacks in the war. So when Germany ultimately lost the war, it was a complete shock to the people because it had been so heavily censored. And as well as being our first large industrial war, the Great War is the first total war where you have men, women, government, everybody has a role to play in this war. This war is going to lead to protests in Russia. So by 1917, it's clear that Tsar Nicholas is not very good at being czar. One of the things that he does, it's a huge mistake, is he insists on taking control of the Eastern Front, which he has very little experience as an actual military commander, so he's no good at it. He's basically leading his soldiers into slaughter. So unhappiness grows at home in Russia because people are starving. They're dying for a war that a lot of people don't understand. So these labor protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg lead to an overthrow of the Tsarist regime and introduce the Bolsheviks, who are Lenin's communists, to power. So Russia's revolution is going to bring the Bolsheviks to power, and the Bolsheviks do not believe in war. So the Bolsheviks are going to withdraw from the war. So with the Russian Revolution box, you need to put that Russia's going to withdraw from the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is going to end the war between Russia and Germany, which in effect is going to allow Germany to send everything they have to the Western Front. So about the same time that the U.S. enters the war, Russia exits the war. So it's not really that big of an advantage that the U.S. enters the war. Here is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It's going to give all of this land, or the striped area, to Germany. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is actually going to humiliate Russia. They are not happy with the ending of the war because they've given up Poland, they've given up Romania, Finland, Lithuania, a lot of land here to Germany. So even though they're kind of happy to be out of the war, the Russians see it as a loss. So women have a new role in the war. They go to work in the factories, they go to work as shopkeepers, they go to work plowing fields. One of their biggest roles, though, is to go to work in munitions factories where they're making weapons for the soldiers. And this is true in Germany, Britain, and the United States. So this is the first time women really see themselves, contributing to society outside of the home. They have a role to play outside of the domestic sphere, which is going to increase political activism with women. We see rising hemlines of dresses to the 1920s, smoking in public, and women really try to recast their gender roles during this time period. But when the men come home from war, the women are expected to go back home to, operating in the domestic sphere. So women are, a lot of women were not happy about having to go back to the way things were once the war ends. Another thing that happens towards the end of the war, the Young Turks of the Ottoman Empire were somewhat successful at fighting off the British in the Middle East. However, they lose several key battles to the Russians in the East. And the Young Turks are going to blame the Armenian Christian minority for these losses. The Armenians basically live in the middle land, like on the border between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. So they're in like Central Asia. And because they're Christian, they're culturally more aligned with Russia than they are with the majority Muslim Ottoman Empire. So the Young Turks say, well, you must be selling secrets to the Russians, otherwise we would never lose to such an inferior power. And they blame their loss on the Armenian Christians and launch a genocide on them. They kill as many as 1 million, and several others are going to run to Russia or into the Middle East. So basically, the Armenian Genocide, the Young Turks blame the Christian Armenians for losses to the Russians and kill over 1 million Armenians. Okay, so 1917, the U.S. enters the war because a couple things Germany's done. First thing is Germany has this policy of unrestricted submarine warfare where they are sinking any ship in British waters without warning, and they end up sinking a passenger cruise liner called the Lusitania that has like 100 and something American citizens on board. And this gets the American public all riled up, but not enough really to declare war on Germany, because for the first 3 years of the war, the United States remains neutral and is profiting off of both sides. They're selling weapons and supplies to both sides of the war, but more so to Britain than Germany by 1917. 1917, Germany sends a telegraph to Mexico called the Zimmermann Note. And in the Zimmermann Note, Germany tells Mexico, if you help us in the war, then Germany will help Mexico regain territory that they've lost to the United States. Well, when the U.S. intercepts this telegraph, they are understandably very upset, and as a result, finally enter the war on the side of the Allies. Most of the American public already supported the Allies because of the cultural and linguistic values that they share with Great Britain. Both speak English, both have experience with democracy, and we have stronger economic ties with Great Britain. So the U.S. is pretty much going to come in 1917 with fresh legs. They come in with more fight in them. They're stronger at this point because, we haven't been fighting for 3 years in trenches. The U.S. comes in with fresh legs, and the added troops are ultimately what helps to finally crush Germany. So on November 11th, 1918, World War I comes to an end. The armistice was signed, and it went into effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So this is why November 11th is celebrated as Remembrance Day or Veterans Day around the world. By the time the war ends, there are over 10 million soldiers and 10 million soldiers dead and 2 million wounded. So we have over 12 million casualties, which is the largest number of casualties that the world has seen from one war to date. So with the legacy of the war, World War I is a completely new kind of war. You have new technologies, such as the tank and the airplanes. You have a new idea of a global war. The war spills out of the Eastern and Western Front into the other regions, like I said, North Africa, parts of Asia. World War I gives us an all-time high in death and destruction. 30 million casualties with 8.5 million soldiers killed, 21 million wounded. Civilians have died because of starvation, disease, slaughter. By the time it's all said and done, you have an entire generation of Europeans wiped out. I think it was 1 in 4 men between the ages of 18 and 25 in Europe were dead. That's a big number. World War I also has a devastating economic impact. It cost $330 billion to fight this war. And in the process, it destroys farmland, it destroys homes, villages, and towns. And it leaves behind this sense of disillusionment among the survivors. The men come home with shell shock, which we now know as PTSD. It's reflected a lot in the literature of the time. After World War I, the survivors kind of have this idea that nothing really matters, there's no point to anything, everything's meaningless. Because they've just spent 4 years fighting a war that they couldn't tell you why they fought. So when it comes to the peace talks, Britain and France, have one goal when it comes to the peace talks, and that's to punish Germany. Clemenceau, who is the French premier, the leader of France, wants to brand Germany or label Germany the aggressor of the war and force them to pay war reparations. Great Britain is a little bit more reserved. David Lloyd George is afraid that if you weaken Germany, it could lead to the spread of communism. So David Lloyd George is a little bit more willing to work with Woodrow Wilson to figure out a better plan for Germany. Oh, good. It's cut off here. Okay, oh well. So the Allies are going to meet and debate for the peace talks. Your big four are Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, is here, George Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. These are the four that are running the peace talks. Russia is not represented, which is important. They're in the middle of a civil war, and even more important is that Germany and their allies are not represented. So basically, it's only one side of the conflict that's trying to sort everything out, so it's highly unlikely that it'll be a fair outcome without both sides represented. Woodrow Wilson has this plan for peace. His big idea is self-determination, letting countries decide what's best for them. His peace plan is called the 14 points, and the first 4 points have to do with getting rid of secret treaties, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduced national armies and navies. So these first 4 are kind of dealing with those militarism, alliances, nationalism, trying to solve those 4 causes of the war. The 5th through 13th points have to do with self-determination, which would be allowing countries to decide what's best for them, which would be trying to see what to do with the colonies of the defeated powers, changing borders, creating new nations with these disrupted empires. And his 14th point is the most famous one, where he proposes this general association of nations that would prevent conflict from breaking out again, which becomes known as the League of Nations, which all of your major powers would get together and be able to, talk about issues and keep each other in line, basically. However, Britain and France, like I said, their goal is to destroy Germany. So they reach a compromise, which is the Treaty of Versailles. The big thing is that it creates a League of Nations, which was Wilson's 14th point. So it's like a first edition of the United Nations. The Treaty of Versailles is also going to punish Germany. Germany is severely reduced in its size. All of its colonies are going to go into what's called a mandate system, where they're controlled by the Allied powers. Instead of being free, they're then controlled as mandates. Their military is downsized. And the big one is Article 231, which is the War Guilt Clause. Germany gets blamed for World War I, all of it. They are forced to pay war reparations, which means that they have to pay the Allied powers back for damages caused by the war. So the $32 billion that they're charged with in 1919 equates to $394 billion in 2005. So in our modern money, it's over almost $400 billion. Germany does not pay these war debts off until, I think, 2010 is when they finally paid off their reparations for World War I. And Germany's territories, all of their colonies, become mandates of the Allies. The mandate system is where colonies are going to be, of the defeated nations, are controlled by one of the Allied powers until they're deemed fit for independence, which basically means until the Allied powers feel like giving them independence. So the Treaty of Versailles is pretty much a peace built on quicksand. It is not successful by any means. The U.S., who comes out of the war as the strongest nation, rejects the League of Nations. The U.S. populace, the Senate, House of Representatives, Congress basically, thinks that the United States should return to isolationism, that they should stay out of Europe's affairs. So without the strongest nation in the world able to enforce the League of Nations, it has no legitimacy, no authority. So the League of Nations is basically worthless without the United States there to kind of regulate and enforce. The German populace, Germans are very bitter about the ending of the war. They do not feel that they should have been blamed for the war. They do not feel that they should have to pay everyone back for the war. So they have a lot of hatred towards Britain and France. And the war reparations initially are going to devastate Germany's economy, which we'll get into in a few days. The fact that the colony's independence was denied is going to lead to a lot of unrest. You have several colonies that think that because they fought in the war or they were territories of defeated nations that they would be independent. For instance, India joined Great Britain's fight because a lot of people, including Gandhi, thought that if they go help Britain win the war, then Britain will repay them with independence. Well, they were wrong. And they were not happy to find out that they didn't get the independence that they desired. Italy and Japan are also very bitter towards the Allied powers because they go to the peace talks hoping to get some of the territories that were given up by Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian, and they didn't get the land that they had hoped. So it turns Italy and Japan against the Allied powers, which is going to lead us directly to World War II. So because of the Treaty of Versailles problems, the problems created by this, it's going to lead us to here, which we'll be at in just a couple days. So make sure that you guys get your graphic organizer filled in as we go through. If you have any questions, bring them with you the next time that we meet, and we will take it from there.